Hi, I'm Asto, and I have a question for you. What is an anime style render? This? Or this? While we all have a general idea of how anime looks like, there is no absolute definition. After all, anime in Japanese just means animation. Looking at some of the recent anime and gacha games, we can definitely see how they all have different blend of stylization and photorealism. So it is absolutely possible to mix in some PBR elements into your render. You don't need to make everything running at a lower frame rate, and you don't always need outlines or a stepped shader. Those techniques only represents the intention and the vision of an artist. The possibility is endless, and it is all your choice. So today, I'll share a few ways you can blend photorealistic elements into your anime renders. Stylized or anime do not always mean they have nothing to do with PBR textures. An amazing Blender creator, Comfy has a video demonstrating just how you can turn PBR shaders into NPR. Make sure you check out his video. But now let me show you guys my examples. Right now in Blender 4.5, I have a bunch of monkey heads or Suzannes in my scene. And each of these columns over here represent a certain shader that I will show you guys how to create. And what I'm gonna do is to turn all these basic wood material into more like what you can see on the top row, which are gonna be more like anime or stylized shaders. So now let me work on the first monkey head over here and try to recreate what's on top. So this is a material that I got from Polyhaven. Usually your PBR materials will come with this setup. So a base color, roughness, maybe metallic, normal, displacement, emission, and you plug them into a principled BSDF and then straight out to the surface. And let me get this clear right off the bat. You can use this exact shader, the PBR photorealistic shader, directly in your anime style renders. Because as long as it fits your scene, as long as it looks good, you can use any form of shaders in your render. In fact, in one of my opening animations, I straight up just used cycles to render the animation. And I just added some freestyle on top and composited my Eevee character and some shadows on top. And that is exactly what you can do for your renders. So now let me turn this material, PBR material, to something more like this first material we have over here. And it's gonna be closer to the Comfy Mug tutorial. Let me go over here and just make a duplicate of this PBR shader, and I can call it version 1. It's gonna be a stylized shader. So let me select the base color, shift click, select the material output, Control I, and hit X to delete everything. And let me Control Shift left click if you have Node Wrangler turned on. Make sure you turn it on. So let's say you think there is way too much detail in your PBR texture, your base color texture, and you want to simplify it just like how they look like in some of the anime. What we can do is to Shift A, color, converter, color ramp, and just put this after the texture. And then we are going to mess with the color ramp for a little bit. We can keep this as linear for now. And let me just start changing these colors into more like a wooden color, maybe a lighter orange, maybe a darker orange, just like this first, and then we can use a lighter orange over here, or a yellow color, whatever you want. Maybe we can bring this closer, maybe something like this. And right now it doesn't have any shading, so let me add some cell shading onto this model. So Shift A, shader, diffuse BSDF, and let me turn off the roughness for this one. Then I'm going to add a converter shader to RGB and just turn this shader output into color. And then I can converter, color ramp, and just create a constant color ramp over here and just move around the color ramp just like this, just to get some shading in. And then I can bring over the nodes just like this. And then I can hit Control Shift right click on the bottom color ramp of the cell shading, drag it onto the color ramp on the top, and just go ahead and say multiply. And we can start getting some shading over here on top of our based material. I can turn this factor all the way to 1, and I can just adjust the color of the color ramp over here to make it a little bit more lighter, perhaps. Then next we can do is to even add some of these shiny highlights over here. So let me just Shift A and then shader. Maybe let's get a glossy BSDF if you want it to be shiny. So let me take a look at this shader. It looks like this. We can decrease the roughness so we have some smaller highlights over here, just like this. And then we can go ahead and duplicate this shader to RGB, so Shift D, put it over here. And then we can Shift D this color ramp as well, put it over here. And now let me turn this color back to black, and we can fix our nodes for a little bit and Control Shift right click on the glossy color ramp and drag it onto the multiply. And then we can change this to add. Now we have some form of glossy surface as well. And of course you can adjust the roughness for a little bit so you don't get some big highlights. Maybe just a little bit. If you want more, you can do this. And of course you can decrease the strength over here so this highlight is not going to be as strong. And now we have this very basic shader for the first monkey head over here. And now let me try to recreate this shader in the middle that is kind of anime but also has a blend of realism in it. And it's very simple. So let me take this second monkey head and let me duplicate the material first and call this version 2 perhaps. And now let me just directly work on this principled BSDF over here. What I can do is to Shift A, shader, diffuse BSDF, and then we can just basically create another cell shading. So converter, shader to RGB, and converter color ramp, and then change this to constant, and then we can give it some shading. And then let me duplicate the shader to RGB and put it after the principled BSDF. Now I can mix the color ramp on top of the PBR shading. So Control Shift right click with node wrangler of course, and drag this onto the shader to RGB on the top. And now I can start with perhaps multiply, and you can get some anime style shading just like this, just by playing around with the factor. But we can also plug this color ramp into the factor instead. And then I'm gonna change this back to mix. And then the top PBR colors, I'm gonna plug it into the B. And the A, I'm gonna change it to a dark brown perhaps. So I can adjust the colors in the color ramp for a little bit, because black stands for A and white stands for B. So right now all the black parts are gonna be outputting this A color. I can just turn this down for a little bit so it's more biased towards the B side. So let me bring it closer to white, so we can bring some of those detail back in, just like this. And just like the first shader, we can just add some highlights to this shader. So let me just grab a Shift A, shader, glossy BSDF, and then turn this into color by shader to RGB. And then we can get a color ramp and plug this color into the color ramp, just like this. And then turn this back to black. Then adjust the roughness. And then Control Shift right click this on top of the mix. And then turn the last mix to add. And then now we have some highlights, but it is optional. Of course, you can turn up the roughness and you can change the colors in the color ramp if you want. But let's say you have a low roughness for the glossy BSDF. Make sure your principled roughness also kind of match that, or else you're gonna have some very shiny highlights on top of some really rough PBR highlights over here. So we can go ahead and use a converter math and just put it after the roughness map, and then I can say multiply, and I can just turn this down so it's a little bit less rough, so it kind of matches the stylized highlights we have over here. So this is the second shader that we have, and for the third one it's just more like a variation of the first one. But let's see, we can go into the third monkey head over here, and then I'm going to name this new material. For this one, I'm going to keep the base color and the normal. So let me delete everything except the base color, normal, and the normal map node, and the output, and just Control I, delete everything else. And similar to the first two shaders, I can just create a diffuse BSDF, converter, shader to RGB, converter color ramp, make it a constant so we can have a cell shading. And then this time I'm not going to modify the base color. I'm just gonna straight up multiply this shadow on top of our base color, and then change this to multiply, turn this up. We can adjust the colors of the color ramp just like what we did for the first two. So this time we are keeping the original texture and just straight up adding some shadows on top. Maybe something like this. But the trick that I want to show you guys for the third shader over here is to actually make use of the normal map, because this way your stylized cell shading can follow the textures a little bit more. As you can see for the first two, they didn't really have any sort of detail on the cell shading shadows. So if you make use of the normal map and plug it into the diffuse BSDF that controls the cell shading, you can get some detailed shadows over here. So these are three variations of anime or stylized shaders, and like I said, the possibility is endless, so make sure you play things around. So now if you have more like a realistic shader over here and you want it to blend more with your scene, you can of course add some outlines to make it look a little bit more anime or stylized. So what I'm gonna do is to go to the materials, and I'm gonna add one more material for the outline. So I'm gonna change this to emission. I'm going to call the material outline, and then I can change this to black. And then I can go ahead and turn on back face culling for camera and shadow. Then go into the modifiers. I'm going to add a modifier that is called solidify. Make it a tiny bit towards the negative side. And then go to normals, check flip. And under material offset, set it to 1. And now we have this. Basic outline. And this technique is called inverted hole. But let me show you two more ways to add outlines. So let me disable the solidify modifier. Then what I can do is to go to the scene settings and go to freestyle over here and just check this. And then if I go to the camera view, let me hit F12 and render one image. You can see under the render result we also have outlines over here. But one advantage of using freestyle is that you can customize the outlines a little bit more compared to the inverted hole method. So under the view layer settings, you can see the freestyle section over here, and there are so many things you can customize. For example, the color of the freestyle, I can make this red and render it again. And now we have red outlines. And let's say I want to vary the thickness for a little bit. I can add a modifier called a long stroke and then change the mapping to curve. Let me just give the outline some variation of thickness. So the higher the curve points, it's going to be thicker in those parts. The lower, it's going to be thinner, just like this. And I can render one more time. And you can see there are variation in thickness right now. And this is very powerful. So the third method is going to be grease pencil. So let me just turn off the freestyle over here. And what I can do is to hit Shift A, grease pencil, blank. And you can't see it in the viewport because it's blank. But we can select the object over here on the side. And then what I can do is to go to the modifiers with the grease pencil object selected, add a modifier called generate line art. And then for the collection, we need a collection for our outline objects. So let me select our Suzanne, hit M, new collection, and then just call it outline. And now go back to the grease pencil object, select the outline, and then the layer, select the default one, and also the material, the default one. And then we can adjust the line radius just like this. And now we have some outlines, but you might be asking, why do the outlines look so weird? It's because this line art shader can only be viewed properly under the camera view. So under the camera view, it looks normal. But if you go out of camera view, it looks really weird. And you can play around with the settings over here, like changing the edge types to silhouette. And you can even add some effects onto the grease pencil. So come over here to effects and add effect glow. And then let me go to the material tab over here and change the outline material to something like white. And now we have glowing outlines. It's really cool. So these are 3 ways of adding outlines onto your object. So now, as an example to demonstrate how powerful the compositor is, I have a scene right here that is in Cycles. And you can see that my character is not shaded correctly because some of the nodes like shader to RGB is not going to be available in Cycles, but that doesn't matter because we will composite an Eevee version of the character on top of this Cycles render later. And the main reason I have my character over here is just to get some of these contact shadows to make sure everything blend well together after I composite the Eevee elements onto this image. So right now everything is properly set up over here. All I have to do is to perhaps enable freestyle to make the render look a little bit more like anime. And now I just have to press F12 to render the image. So now this is our render in Cycles with freestyle outlines, and I'm now going to the image settings and just save this image real quick. So now I've opened another file in Blender. It's basically the exact same scene, it's just rendered in Eevee, and I have all the shaders set up based on the NPR non-photorealistic workflow. But most importantly, I want my character to be shaded correctly because I want to layer my character on top of the Cycles render that we did earlier. And technically I can just isolate my character and hide everything else in render so I can have an image of my character with a transparent background. But I'm going to show you another way to isolate the character without hiding everything else. And that trick is going to be handy when it comes to compositing. So what I want to do right now is to go to the view layer settings, go to crypto matte and check object. And this function is going to be useful later. But now let me hit F12 and render the image once. So now we have our image rendered. We can go to the compositing workspace, and this is what you're going to see. And what I'm going to do is to check use nodes, and I'm just going to drag out another window over here and change it to the image editor. And in this window, I'm going to open up our render result. And first of all, let me just save this image. And after we save our image, what we want to do is to go to the compositor window over here and hit Shift A and then go to mask and then crypto matte. And then I'm going to drag the image into the image. And then let's take a look at the crypto matte. So Control Shift click twice until the matte is connected to the viewer over here. And right now you can't see anything because we have not yet created our mask. And I'm going to hit plus over here and go over to the render window and just choose my character. So maybe the hair first. And now you can see the matte has a mask of the hair. And now I can just select everything that belongs to my character. So now I have all the parts of my character selected, and we have a mask over here that is gonna be really handy. What I can do right now is to go ahead and Shift A, output file output. And then I'm gonna connect the matte to the image. And what this node is going to do is to render a separate file that is based on whatever input that is connected to the image. So right now I have the matte connected to the image. So when we render a frame, we will get the original image from here directly to the composite. That is going to be our original image. And this matte will also be output based on the file path you input over here. So you can type in your file path over here, and when you hit F12, you will get two images. But let's say you are going to render an animation, it is going to be very handy to have this file output node because you don't have to like render things twice. You just have to render once and you get the matte, the mask, and also the original image all at once. But now I'm going to hit F12 and I'm going to get my matte or my mask in the file path that I've input over here. So now I have opened another brand new scene in Blender, and right here it doesn't matter what the render engine is, and I'm just gonna come here and make sure in color management the view transform is standard, so it's not gonna affect the colors of our composite. So right now I'm going to go to the composite window, and you are supposed to see some nodes over here by default, but I've just deleted everything else except the viewer and the composite. And right now make sure you hit use nodes over here, and what I'm gonna do is to Shift A, input image, and I'm gonna need 3 of them. So Shift D, and now I have 3 images. And now I'm going to open my Cycles render, my Eevee render, and my mask. So now I have 3 images loaded into the compositor. So I have the Cycles layer with a weird cursed character, the Eevee render, and also the mask. What I can do is to just use the compositor to composite my character itself onto the Cycles render. So let me just go to Shift A, color, mix, alpha over. And I'm going to plug the Cycles layer to the first image, the Eevee render to the second image, and the mask to the vector. And then I'm going to take a look at this result. And now you can see my Eevee character is layered on top of the Cycles render. And everything else is Cycles, but my character is in Eevee. So now I want a background color under everything. So I'm going to duplicate the alpha over, and then I'm going to put this image on the top so it's layered on top. And now we can change the background color just like this. So maybe I'm going to choose something like an orange yellow, so it's like around the time of sunset. So if you want to blend everything together even more, you can add some effects like bloom. So Shift A, maybe go to filter, glare, and put it after the alpha over. And then I'm going to come here and choose bloom, and I'm going to decrease the threshold of the highlights. And now you can see there's a glow on top of everything, and my character is a little bit more blended onto the Cycles render, and that's pretty nice. And you can even do some color grading in this compositor. So Shift A, perhaps go to color, adjust, and let me use RGB curves over here and put behind everything. And I can like adjust the contrast a little bit. I can increase the red, maybe decrease the blue for a little bit, and then maybe we can adjust the RGBs so it's more like sunset. And now if we get ourselves an image editor and we take a look at the render result, and we can just connect everything to the composite node, and you can see right here our image looks pretty nice because our Eevee character feels very coherent with the Cycles render over here. And it is really nice to use this trick when you want to render metal objects, because sometimes the reflections in Eevee is not as good as Cycles. So maybe you can let Cycles render some of those reflective materials, or you can even render your entire background in Cycles and just like what I did here, overlay your Eevee character on top, and it can blend pretty well with some compositing and color correction. Art is a realm with infinite possibilities. Play with everything you have access to when you're making art, because there's literally no rules. So be creative, play with all the settings, and decide how you want your renders to look like. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.